Hello and welcome to another webinar co-organized by the International Manifesto Group and the Friends of Socialist China. Our title today is The Bandung Spirit Lives On, Unity Against Imperialism and the Struggle for a Multipolar Order. I'm Radhika Desai, convener of the International Manifesto Group and the moderator of this event. The legacy of the Bandung Conference is often dismissed. It referred, it is said, to a unity of African and Asian peoples that was not in evidence. It was unable to end the polarization of the world or even of Asia in the Cold War. It left no lasting institutional legacy. It could not prevent rivalries, conflicts, and even wars among the countries that were represented there. However, Bandung appears a failure only if one attributes to the conference goals it never had. Its true purposes and success are thrown into relief only against the history of the imperial international order that came into being with the advent of capitalism, against the background, that is, of its geopolitical economy. The chief motor of this geopolitical economy has been and remains the dialectic between the major capitalist powers' drive to subordinate the rest of the world, preventing it from pursuing its own development and instead forcing it to support the development of the imperial world, a drive that peaked in 1914, and the opposing drive to resist and repeal this subordination by pursuing autonomous national development, usually socialist or socialistic. This opposing drive gathered momentum in the middle of the 20th century, has had considerable achievements to its credit, but still has far to go. The April 1955 Bandung Conference marked the formal start of a new stage in its anti-imperialist resistance, one where the need to transform the structure of the world economy was put on the agenda. From the vertical hub-and-spoke relations of domination and subordination between a small number of European powers, their offshoots, and Japan, on the one hand, and the rest of the world subordinated to them in colonial and semi-colonial ways on the other, the world began moving slowly, with many interruptions, deviations, and even reversals, to one of horizontal relations of solidarity, development, and mutually beneficial economic and trade relations. This process is still ongoing, and that is why Bandung remains relevant today. Perhaps at the core of this process was the recognition that the sovereignty of a country extended to its right to organize its economy in any way it saw fit. The element of Bandung that best expressed this was Nehru's insistence that communist China must be included, and the success Zhou Enlai made of this opportunity. For centuries, the West had considered it its right and prerogative to compel countries to open up their economies for the benefit of its own corporations and enterprises, on pain of formal and informal colonization, which would forcefully effect the same. Effectively, while the so-called Westphalia system operated among the world's capitalist countries, countries that did not meet the essentially capitalist standard of civilization could be legally subjugated, and often very violently so. If the nationalist and socialist revolutions that forced decolonization on the world's agenda were to mean anything, they were to mean refusing this principle above all. A decade before, the United Nations Charter had accepted the principles of equal sovereignty, prohibition of force in settling disputes, and of non-interference in domestic affairs, which effectively amounted to the recognition of economic sovereignty, contrary to the principles of the Westphalia system. The previous year, that is to say the year before Bandung, China and India had signed the Panchashil Agreement, underlining the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, including not only these principles of the UN Charter, but also enshrining the principle of cooperation between different types of countries for mutual benefit. This amounted to an insistence, therefore, that even countries with different, in effect, socialist political systems were not to be shunned. The importance of this cannot be overemphasized at the historical moment at which the Bandung Conference took place, when the vast majority of the world's peoples was in the process of recovering its sovereignty, which meant nothing if not economic sovereignty. Only by modifying, reversing, and repealing liberal free market principles, which the imperial world has sought to impose on the colonized world, was any development possible. Development was the urgent need of this majority of the world's peoples. Respect of the right of nations to pursue development through the economic forms that suited them best was the most important right they had to assert. Denying such development, with what power remained in their hands, of course, has been the overriding purpose of the imperial powers in the decades since. That was what the Cold War was about. Communism was not necessarily, well, communism was an enemy, of course, but it was particularly an enemy because it was the strongest challenge to imperialism. At the same time, it was the strongest challenge in a long line that neither began nor ended with it. And that is why the West has continued, indeed recharged its imperial drive after the formal end of the original Cold War, and indeed has sparked new ones. Bandung remains relevant today because these battles are closer to victory, chiefly through the processes it was convened to further. Today, the decline in the power of the imperial world is accelerating, and of China in particular is rising. As the developing world increasingly asserts its sovereignty, pursues development, vertical imperial hub-and-spoke relations are falling away, and new forms of horizontal international cooperation for mutually beneficial development are emerging within it. The Bandung spirit went on to inspire the non-aligned movement, the creation of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the demand for a new international economic order, the many alliances of developing countries that contributed to ensuring that the WTO enshrined the right of developing nations to pursue illiberal forms of economic policy. And it continues to light the way for the formations of the BRICS Plus and the constantly thickening set of alliances, agreements, and partnerships of the countries of the Third World that is the essence of multipolarity.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on this screen.